I was thinking about this topic and I was reminded of a story or something that happened in my own life maybe 3.5 years ago. I was visiting India, my parents in Chennai, that's where I grew up. And I was there only for 5 days. And I had a very specific objective, which was that my grandparents, my mother's parents, who were my mother's father now, I think is 98 or 99, and my grandmother is in her 90s too. After that stage, it doesn't matter, the numbers don't really make a lot of sense. Anyway, they had reached a point where it was obvious that they couldn't live in their house anymore. They were living independently until then in their own home. And the 5 days that I was there, one of the tasks that I was pretty busy. My grandmother was very detached. She had given away all the things of value, her jewelry, her silk saris or whatever. She was done with all of that, but still there was this home with all the furniture and, I don't have to explain all the things that still were not given away, that were not easy to give away. So my job was to look at stuff, what needs to be thrown away, listing in the Craigslist equivalents in India, trying to figure out, and then texting 6 different people to come look at that, the couch or whatever. And so I was looking at stuff, and I have to share a little bit of how I grew up before I say this. Both my parents had busy jobs. My mother was a teller in a bank, and she had to commute for work. So most of my childhood, my grandmother would pick me up from school, and I would spend most of the afternoon, evening with my grandparents, and then I would go to my home only to sleep at night because it would be past 7 by the time my mother got back. So I grew up in this house with all of this stuff. But after the age of 10, I stepped out of that reality. I was no longer with all those things. Anyway, I was looking at this one cupboard. This was dark in color. God knows how old it was. I have a lot of memories from my childhood with this cupboard. And then it was, I think, wood. I couldn't even figure it out, or paper mache or whatever it was. And I looked at it and I opened this, trying to figure out what are we going to do with this of all the many things I was looking at in that home. And suddenly, almost in a flash, all these memories came into my mind like a flood. My memory of this cupboard is very different. It was so huge. Probably when I was 5 or 6 years old, now it just looked as tall as I was, and it was kind of junky, and it didn't serve a whole purpose. But I remember when I couldn't reach the top shelves. That was the only memory I had, because I probably haven't seen that cupboard in the last 30 years. And suddenly I was in front of this thing that had a lot of impressions in my subconscious. I only could reach the first 2 shelves. And I remember arranging my things when I was 5 or 6 years old in that cupboard. My drawing books, my wax crayons, or whatever they were. Somehow that image was very vivid in my own mind. And, coming back from my school, my grandmother bringing me back, and I was eagerly looking forward to my coloring books or whatever I wanted to do that evening. And I would open that cupboard and find my space there. I was reminded of this because as I was standing there, it almost became a contemplative experience for me. And I've thought about that one scene and instance the last 3 years quite a few times, because everything had changed from the last time I remember that incident, that cupboard, and that whole scene. But I was just so acutely aware that nothing had changed. Somehow it felt like I was an entirely different person standing there looking at this, processing all of these memories, and I was just that same 6-year-old boy. It was so confusing in a certain way. None of those things that excited me, that meant something to me at that age, it's not the same anymore. My life is so different. And yet, I could just feel intensely how much I was that same person. That so many details have unfolded in these last 30 years, 35 years, whatever it has been, since I last remember that scene. And yet, I was deeply in touch with and connected with that person that I was, that child. And I was reminded of this story again because it almost became a contemplative experience for me. Because for those of you that are familiar and read the autobiography of a yogi a few times, you can probably already think of what instance in the book I was reminded of through this story, chapter 45, where Yogananda talks about the bliss-permeated mother, Anandamoyi Ma. And she was a great woman saint who lived in India during the time of Yogananda. And he visited her when he went back to India in the 30s. And there's this beautiful exchange, very poetic, between Yogananda and Ma when they first meet. I'm sure many of you know what I'm talking about. And then he asks her, there is not a lot I need to know about you, but would you tell for the sake of my disciples a little bit about your life story? And then she says, there's not much to tell. And she says, Father, before I entered my mother's womb, I incarnated on this plane. I was the same. I was a small girl playing in my home. I was the same. Then I grew up. And then my family arranged for this body to get married. And I was still the same. And my husband, with passion, came close to me at the night of our wedding and touched me. And he got a lightning shock. And I was still the same. He immediately pleaded to accept him as my disciple, and I quietly agreed. I was still the same. Through all, I don't know how she exactly puts it, I think she says, through the dance of creation in the hall of eternity, I remain the same and I will always be the same. It was so silly, and all of us can perhaps think of things in our own life that have this strong sense of nostalgia, but somehow that one instance was so vivid for me in terms of tuning into what it meant to be changeless, to have that connection with a part of us that's actually not affected by what's happening, all the details of our life, because there are a lot of them. Life just unfolds in its own way. And this concept of the eternal now, what does it mean to be in the moment? We talk about it, be in the moment. What it really means is to be changeless, to be identified that which is not constantly moving, which is not constantly restless on the ripples of the ocean, but rather to go deeper within. And that's why we have that verse from the Gita, to live in the eternal now is to meditate deeply and be still inside. And how do we do that? Many years ago, I was driving somewhere and I heard this talk by Swami Kriyananda, and I remember one line which he says in the beginning of that talk, which was very powerful for me, because I have to say, I read Stephen Hawking's Brief History of Time, a very famous book. I'm sure many of you have heard about it. I was very fascinated by that subject at the end of high school. And I kept reading more and more. I was drawn to higher physics, all these ideas of how science doesn't know what it's talking about, or time is a construct of the mind. It's a paradigm within which we function. Causality is just assumed because we are living in linear time. What does any of that even mean? How do I apply anything in my own life? Because it's so distant. It's intellectually fascinating. But this talk of Swami Kriyananda, there's one sentence that he mentioned in the beginning of the talk. It brought all of that home to me as a practice, because he said, time is a product of movement. Time is a product of movement. I thought about that. Now that is something you can work with. And it's not just physical movement. And also, I'm not going to go into it right now. It makes a lot of sense with reference to higher physics when you think about atomic physics or theory of relativity and all of that. That's not the point. But the movement we are talking about is also movement within. When we are constantly moving within and not still, there is time. And time becomes exaggerated. Our own sense of past and future tends to overwhelm because it becomes so real. We are in the moment, but we are so identified with it that past and future start feeling so distant. Whereas living in the eternal now is to pull back to a place where they are not as separate. To be able to see everything as one whole and to know there is only one moment. Not one moment before and one moment after, but there is just the moment. Last evening, I had, it was sort of completely unplanned. I somehow entered into this conversation with someone who was having a hard time. And, I'm not always on my phone and reading news. I had not read the news. Some of you are probably aware of the news from last evening about the war and everything. This person was having a lot of anxiety around that. He had family. He was originally from the Middle East, and he now lives here. And his wife and kids were visiting, back there. And he was really struggling with what was happening. And I was trying to say something to him that might be helpful and just have a conversation, give a listening ear. But throughout that, I had not read the news. I did not know. For those of you who still don't know, last evening, America entered the Middle East war because, there were sites in Iran that were bombed by the US, which is a pretty significant escalation. But when I was chatting with this friend, I did not know that that's what was causing him the anxiety. Of course, makes a lot of sense. But later on, when I opened the news later that night, I started reading, and I wasn't anxious or fearful as this other person was, but there was just this sense of sadness in my heart. Just, wow, we have been through this before. I don't mean I, but we, the greater mankind, has been through this before. We have, I have had a lot of academic interest in war. I've studied World War II and also Vietnam War, Korean War, Iraq and Afghanistan, and all the things that many of us in this room have lived through. And I know how it all started, how we all got confused, how every time we get confused and we make choices that are just not good. How could we be so ignorant rather than just thinking who's doing what? Just we as mankind, why are we so ignorant? And this was all last night as I was thinking about it and the eternal now. And thankfully, I was inspired to pick up a book I had not picked up in a long time by Thich Nhat Hanh. I know many of you may have heard about this great saint, essentially, who lived during our times. He left his body only a few years ago. And he was a monk during the Vietnam War. Just going to take a sip of water. Thich Nhat Hanh was a monk during the Vietnam War. And there were so many stories that were so deeply inspiring. I remember reading them, but it was so beautiful going through them again last night. When the war began, there's this whole chronology of what all happened with him. Basically, he said, what kind of a practice would it be to chant and burn incense when children are being bombed? So he engaged in activism, but of the highest kind. He was an ambassador for peace, and he started also relief work, helping people that were affected by the war. And I just want to share a couple of stories which were very inspiring for me. And I'll come back to the eternal love, which is what this is all about. There was a time that he describes, in fact, one of the fellow monks writes about this. They were all walking, 3 of them were walking towards a relief site, or towards a war zone. And as they were proceeding, just about 100 feet away, the group of homes or huts that they were walking towards, it was bombed by American fighter jets. And they describe how all 3 of them just paused. There were no words exchanged. They just became still, breathed 3 times. And they started walking towards that home that got bombed because, of course, they wanted to see if the people survived. And there is another beautiful story. Let me think about this. There's so many that are coming to my mind. Maybe I'll share this one story. Later on, when the war ended, the crisis was so far from over. This was still, there was a lot of damage, and ultimately, as most of you know, the communists took over the country, and thousands were trying to flee, and they were called the boat people because they were all trying to get on these makeshift boats, trying to flee the country. And Thich Nhat Hanh was again involved in this refugee crisis, trying to get them on the boat. And this is the quote that touched me the most, and perhaps something for all of us to think about as we also go through these troubled times, where he says, if one person in a boat could be calm, could breathe, and be in the moment, and be solid like a tree, that boat will not sink. Just to sit with that idea. He also said stillness is the most powerful force in the entire universe. Just to think about, the mind has its way of creating ripples of anxiety and negative emotions, often that are rooted in our heart because we have our own karmic lessons to learn. And it tells you why it's important to act in a way that you engage more, or rather try to pursue an outcome. But oftentimes, the power of stillness is underestimated. And you have to remember, this was not, you hear that quote and it sounds like something so inspiring you would, put as a screensaver or something. But you have to think about the fact that this was a real teaching. This was actually the difference between life and death. He was saying this to the exact people that were getting on that boat. This was not preaching. This was actually practice. And we come to this idea of the eternal now and peace within. It takes a great amount of stillness. That's really what we are here to learn. That's why we all chose to incarnate at these times where the world is, of course, troubled in so many ways. There are Swami Kriyananda demonstrated this in his life so many times. I'm going to end the talk sooner because we have a vow ceremony that will be inspiring that we can all share in. But I want to share this one favorite quote of mine from Swami Kriyananda, which has helped me a great deal in my own practice. This is from the book Living Wisely, Living Well, which is, as you may know, it has a small little pitty saying for each day of the year, and this is actually from July 6th. My bottom line for many years has not been money, profit, or outer success of any kind, but always inner peace. I've refused to allow myself to become so stressed as to sacrifice that true wealth. I've even deemed it better to leave important things undone if my peace might be undermined by giving them attention, for without it, I would be prone to error. From inner peace have come enlightened decisions. People's expectations of me can never equal what God Himself expects. My peace in the thought of Him. To live in changelessness, to live in the eternal now, is to always be in touch with that peace within. To never lose sight, because that is the greatest trick that Maya plays on us. That's the greatest trick time plays on us. Time is Maya, Maya is time. But we can't undo that by reading The Brief History of Time, as much as it's a great book. It might be very interesting and might be inspiring if you're into that kind of reading. How we can undo that is through the practice of stillness. Because peace and stillness are two sides of the same coin. And constantly, our life, the world is presenting us opportunities to be able to see, when our mind goes through overthinking, or when we are drawn into that loop of going in circles, to think about the fact that even when the refugees in Vietnam were struggling for their life, not knowing whether their boat will reach anywhere or just sink into the ocean, what they were practicing is one breath at a time. To be still, to be calm, and to be in the moment. So it's not all that hard in our lives if you think about it. We just have to remember to come back to the breath. And this is the last thing I'll say, which perhaps is obvious to all Kriya Yogis who have studied the teachings, but it's important to remember, it cannot be done with the mind. It has to be done with the breath. It has to be done by drawing our energy within. Stillness cannot be found. You cannot stop thinking about past and future by telling your mind not to do that. This was kind of what I was feeling with this friend of mine yesterday. I was having this conversation while he was having all of his anxieties. I did not tell him that because it may not have meant much. But we all can realize that and take that deeply into our own hearts. We cannot come out of this loop by thinking about it or trying harder and harder. The moment we tune into our breath, we tune into that flow of energy in our spine, we realize that stillness is closer than we think. God bless you.
Let's just take a moment. And we'll have some music.
in ecstasy. 'Twas a day sanctified by God. There He showed me the truths of truths which all seeking Him should know. How the soul made to live in freedom can reclaim its eternal light. How the night